Yeah, my name is Becky, and I did my PhD here at Tizard, and Vivi has introduced me, so this slide essentially we've covered. Today I am going to be doing an overview talk of the research that I conducted through my PhD. I don't know how well this will work, but my plan is to try and give you a bit of a quick overview of the kind of whole of my PhD. We'll see how well that goes once we get to the end. But I wanted to first start by a bit of background context around sort of genetics and ABA before moving on to introducing you to Fragile X syndrome, if you're not familiar with it already. And then talk a bit about a couple of systematic reviews that we conducted looking at kind of what we know already about challenging behaviour and Fragile X, and then looking at physiological arousal in Fragile X and how that might relate to these key behaviours. And then we're going to try and do a speedy overview of 3 studies that we conducted which aim to assess the possible associations between arousal and challenging behaviour in this group. And then at the end, we faced some interesting challenges through the project, and so what I'll do is kind of finish by talking about what our experiences might teach other people wanting to do this sort of research. Many of you will be already aware, but I'm starting just from the dead basics in case there's anyone in the room who's not. Applied behaviour analysis is kind of based on the principles of operant conditioning. And it's a very well understood and well supported approach to understanding challenging behaviours. But one of the issues that we have in ABA is that there's lots of genetic syndromes that are associated with learning disabilities that have a heightened risk for challenging behaviours. Some of you might be aware of a condition called Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, in which there is almost universal self-injurious behaviour, particularly sort of lip biting and self-hitting. But there's also a number of different genetic conditions that have increased risk for either self-injurious behaviour or aggressive behaviour relative to sort of the group of people with intellectual disabilities more broadly, as shown by this study by Aaron and colleagues. And the problem really is that this operant model alone, which is based on sort of inadvertent conditioning of challenging behaviours and largely focuses on an individual's external environment, the sort of pure operant model alone can't really account for this variation between different genetic groups, because you'd expect the kind of environmental context that might lead to challenging behaviours being kind of randomly distributed, and you sort of wouldn't expect these variations in the likelihood for different sorts of challenging behaviour. And it's a bit of a sort of common misconception really that sort of applied behaviour analysis ignores the potential influence of genetics. Skinner acknowledged this right in his early work. But I think one of the issues is that there's a sort of lack of a model for considering how we incorporate these sorts of internal influences into our kind of typical behavioural model for understanding issues like challenging behaviour. And so there's been some work done by Peter McGill and an earlier PhD student, Paul Langthorne, to look at how we might be able to integrate sort of more biological influences like genetic events, like neurobiological events like side effects of medication, and physiological events like health conditions into a kind of behavioural model to understand challenging behaviours. And it was proposed that motivational differences might be a way that we can account for this variation. So for those of you who might not be aware, motivating operations are have a value altering. So they mean that the value of a certain reinforcer is altered. So a kind of typical example would be that if I haven't had a drink for a long time, then that water over there is going to look particularly appetising. And sort of as a result, I might engage in behaviours that lead to me accessing a drink more frequently. And typically, research on motivating operations has looked at relatively kind of transient environmental influences like deprivation of water or deprivation of attention, for instance. But it was proposed that we might be able to look at genetic events as more enduring motivational influences upon behaviour. And as circled on there, sorry, I forgot to put that there. And the applications of this, or what this would mean, is that we would expect there to be differences in the distribution of functions of challenging behaviour, both within syndrome groups and between different syndrome groups. Because what the model predicts is that for someone with a certain condition, a certain response to challenging behaviour might be particularly reinforcing or less reinforcing than it would be for somebody who didn't have that genetic condition. And so there's some preliminary evidence to support this, both using direct methods of functional assessment and indirect methods of functional assessment, looking at people who have Fragile X syndrome as well as a condition called Smith-Magenis syndrome. And in the indirect study, they also looked at people with mixed etiology learning disabilities. And an example of the sorts of things that they found is that in Fragile X syndrome, people were less likely to engage in attention-maintained challenging behaviour when compared to other functions. And also, when compared to other groups, they were less likely to engage in attention-maintained challenging behaviour. But these are kind of some preliminary studies, and more work was needed to be done. But kind of to reiterate before I move on and talk about things in a little bit more specifically, it's kind of like, why did this potentially matter? And it's that if we do understand how and sort of the mechanisms by which genetic syndromes might influence the operant conditioning of challenging behaviours, we might be able to better teach behaviours proactively to help prevent these behaviours occurring and sort of address these motivational differences. Or it might help us to best tailor interventions for individuals if challenging behaviours are occurring, sort of give us ideas about what we might be wanting to look at first in that individual's environment. But as I said, this kind of whole area of research requires further investigation. And also, to date, there hadn't been any exploration of the possible mechanisms, kind of how might a given condition sort of have create motivational changes that then influence the learning of challenging behaviours. And so that's the kind of a very whizzed through background of the kind of context in which we started the research that we did during my PhD. So I'm going to jump back a little bit. I've mentioned Fragile X syndrome in the earlier slides, but just to introduce you to a bit more to what Fragile X syndrome is. So it's an X-linked genetic condition, which means that typically it affects boys and men more clearly, but you can get, girls can be sort of as kind of severely affected as boys, and even those that have more subtle effects can experience quite challenging effects of the condition. It's the most common inherited cause of learning disability and affects about 1 in 4,000 boys and men, about 1 in 8,000 girls and women. And it's also the most common single gene cause of autism, and I've kind of put that in italics because kind of on the surface people with Fragile X will often show quite a lot of autistic-like behaviour, things like repetitive behaviour, very high levels of anxiety, particularly social anxiety. You'll see quite a lot of avoidance and withdrawal. So quite a classic thing when I was meeting with someone is that someone would come and try and sort of shake your hand and say hi to you, but be completely turned away from you, or sort of saying hello and looking at the ground. There's a really great piece of video footage of some young guys that we know through our charity that were on This Morning with Katie Price. So any 18-year-old boy would be very excited to be a glamour model. But she comes upstairs looking all fabulous, and they both sort of say, "Hi, Katie," and then leave the room, but are talking to her kind of from around the corner. It's quite a good kind of example of that mix of real kind of social interest, but anxiety and withdrawal. So that's kind of why there's this kind of autistic-like thing. It's around a third of people with Fragile X will meet the full criteria for autism, and more on the spectrum. And so, yeah, skipping on to first systematic review of the PhD, we wanted to understand first what do we already know about challenging behaviours in Fragile X syndrome. Specifically, what do we know about the prevalence, the topography of these behaviours, and the operant function. So I did a lovely trawl of lots of online databases, and there was initially 898 manuscripts that came up, but by the time we whittled those down and looked at them more closely, there were 39 that we included in the end. And these figures are sort of weighted averages of the reported prevalence of challenging behaviour across all of the studies that we included in the review. So you'll see that it's kind of around 40 to 45% of males engaged in either self-injurious behaviour or aggression, and a smaller proportion of females, kind of more around like 15%. And self-injurious behaviours were more common than aggressive. In males, self-biting was the most common form of self-injurious behaviour, and that self-injurious behaviour was most typically focused on the hand or the arm. So you might, if you've worked with someone with Fragile X before, you might see, quite often you'll see hand biting that's kind of focused around the base of the thumb or around the kind of knuckles. And so that kind of confirmed what, anecdotally, we already knew in terms of the topography of these self-injurious behaviours. And perhaps unsurprisingly, hitting was the most common form of aggression that was reported across the studies. But sort of of most interest, I suppose, for the area that we're looking at is that for boys and men, there hadn't really been any research with females with Fragile X. Sort of an escape or an avoidance function for challenging behaviours was the most common. We called it social negative in the review. And that was typically challenging behaviour which kind of was to escape or avoid demands, and that was a mixture of kind of academic and social demands, but more weighted towards the academic demands, and also escape from transitions. So the aim of that review was just to kind of get a bit of a picture of what we know about challenging behaviours in this group. But then the next question was why? Why might we be seeing high levels of avoidant behaviour in this group? What might be elevating the motivation to escape from sort of environmental challenges like the presentation of difficult demands? And what we decided to look at, we considered a few possibilities relating to the Fragile X phenotype. But settled on wanting to have a look at differences in stress or kind of arousal-related physiology. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on sort of the specific anatomy of these systems, but some of you will be aware of the autonomic nervous system that kind of drives your fight or flight response. And there's been some reviews of the literature looking at the autonomic nervous system in Fragile X, and found there's kind of a bit of a double hit of elevations in that kind of fight or flight and sympathetic side of the system, and also problems with the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your kind of rest and restore. So in terms of this autonomic nervous system, people seem to be kind of measuring as kind of being in that kind of high arousal state, sort of more chronically than perhaps you or I would be. And similarly, we conducted a systematic review looking at the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the sort of second stress-related physiological system. So you kind of initially have this kick of your fight or flight, but then your HPA axis releases a hormone called cortisol that helps you to manage your response to stress kind of over a longer period of time, because it's not kind of great for your body to be in that initial kind of like bolt out of here state for too long. And we found some evidence that there's for atypical regulation of this system in kind of both humans and mice, or the mouse model of Fragile X, that sort of resulted on sort of in a slight trend on overall increases in cortisol relative to comparison groups. So what that perhaps means is, kind of reflecting the sort of potential issues that we're seeing in the autonomic nervous system, is an overall kind of physical hyperreactivity to stresses or environmental challenges. And so there was a Paul and Peter sort of hypothesised a model whereby this kind of altered stress-related responding interacts with environmental stresses, like the presentation of challenging demands, and leads to an exaggerated physiological kind of stress response, and with the associated physical changes. And because this kind of heightened stressed state is aversive, this or maybe we're not exactly sure of the mechanisms, but it's hypothesised that this heightened kind of stress response leads to an increased motivation to kind of escape from whatever it is in your environment that's causing you stress, which is perhaps why we're seeing high levels of this kind of escape or avoidance challenging behaviour in this group. And kind of similarly, I mentioned earlier that in the research that had been done previously, there was sort of low levels of attention maintained challenging behaviours seen. So kind of perhaps there's a diminished motivation to seek out attention from other people, because these other people might be asking you to do things that are going to kind of stress you out and evoke this sort of aversive kind of stress response. And perhaps that is why we see low levels of attention main challenging behaviour in this group. But this model was purely hypothetical, and what we wanted to do is have a look and see, can we see any association between challenging behaviours, kind of specifically those in the contexts of kind of environmental challenges, and these sort of physiological changes, or these physiological kind of measures in this group. So it requires investigation. So what we wanted to do initially is see, so you're able to measure indicators of these kind of stress-related systems through saliva samples. What you do is you get someone to hold a little sort of spongy foam swab in their mouth for 1 to 2 minutes, and that will absorb some lovely saliva, and we then take it to the lab and can look at levels of this kind of stress hormone cortisol. And also there's a digestive enzyme called alpha amylase, which seems to be an indicator of kind of overall like autonomic arousal, so more relating to that kind of fight or flight system. And there has been some research looking at salivary measures in people with Fragile X, but we were really conscious of the fact that we were potentially working with a subgroup who were, exhibited challenging behaviours. Perhaps they had quite a lot of sensory issues, and that this, holding this swab in their mouth might be aversive. We wanted to give that a go. So our initial plan was to go and visit 5 boys with Fragile X and their unaffected siblings at home to do some initial feasibility around the collection of these samples, and basically see what the response was like to that. And whilst we were there, to do some observations of challenging behaviours to see, what in kind of a natural context, what is going on in the environment when these behaviours are occurring. This will be a fun theme through the talk about recruitment challenges. So this first study, we had aimed initially to recruit 5 families. Months and months and months later, we still kind of had, I think, 1 or 2 it was a very slow process. In the end, we decided, because it had sort of taken so long, we would take on board any families that came to approach us to try and make this into a kind of more of a sort of first study rather than a pure feasibility study. We ended up with, I read this on the slides, 15 pairs of siblings, so boys that had Fragile X syndrome and girls or boys that were siblings who were not known to be carriers or be affected by Fragile X or had been tested negative. What we found is that actually, despite our concerns, the boys in particular with Fragile X kind of loved the saliva samples. They were a little bit gross, so I think they were kind of fun. I did learn, however, that people didn't get my Homer Simpson prompts when I was asking them to draw. They just looked at me blankly, so maybe I'm getting older. But overall, the saliva sampling was rated as acceptable by the participants, by their parents. Sorry, Homer's just going to keep going round. And we had pretty limited compliance issues. Actually, it seemed to look like a method that we would be able to use in future studies. And are there any differences, sorry, I should have put that there, were there any differences in the levels of kind of these arousal-related indicators? The answer is kind of maybe. There was some evidence that the boys with Fragile X had reduced cortisol levels around awakening, which might be an indicator of chronic stress. But what we kind of had expected to see based on previous research was increases in levels of cortisol in the boys with Fragile X compared to their siblings. And that's not what we saw, which was really interesting, but it was obviously a relatively small study. So we'd done, and then, whilst I was getting up at ungodly hours to try and get these kids to spit for me at like 5 in the morning. Also through those days, we were observing challenging behaviours. And of the 15 boys that I observed in kind of across the home and school environment on a sort of otherwise typical day, obviously it was not completely typical because I was there trying to get saliva from them, the majority, 14 out of 15, exhibited challenging behaviours. And demands, kind of as we perhaps expected based on the earlier research, were the most common antecedents for instances of aggression and sort of destructive behaviours. So that might be ripping up work or banging doors or kind of physical destructive behaviours. But self-injurious behaviours like hand biting most commonly occurred when the individual was alone or playing. So that might be playing with something by themselves or playing with other people. Throwing a ball into a net and being excited and biting their hand. And when because we sort of did ABC charts essentially, and the most common perceived kind of social function for individual instances of behaviour was escape, kind of as we'd expected based on the review. But across the group, sort of non-social functions, kind of automatic, was the most common perceived function for self-injurious behaviour, like self-biting. But when we kind of looked at what for each individual, what the sort of perceived primary function was, there was a much more mixed picture. So it wasn't like a nice clear, we see loads of escape behaviour and very low anything else. It was a bit more of a mixed picture in that regard. So there was some support for this kind of hypothesis that we think that there might be elevated escape behaviour in this group, but yeah, it's a bit mixed. But it was a relatively obviously uncontrolled environment and a very small sample size, and so we did sort of have a bit of a look at our data to see whether we could see any potential associations between arousal levels via the saliva samples across the day and the occurrence of challenging behaviours. We couldn't really see anything, but that perhaps is unsurprising. So what we wanted to do is for my kind of main study, to do a more controlled investigation of whether there are any associations between kind of escape maintained behaviour and arousal. And so essentially the question that we wanted to ask was, are there motivational differences between individuals who have Fragile X syndrome and those who have learning disabilities? So as I mentioned, there's sort of some evidence when we look at the function of challenging behaviours. But typically, sort of differences in motivation are kind of assessed by almost assessing reinforcer strength by demonstrating a new behaviour and then responding to it in a certain way. So for instance, you might show someone a simple action like putting a block into a box and then respond to that with by providing them a break or providing them with a tangible reinforcer. And this sort of had been done generally in kind of work looking at motivating operations in the wider literature, but we thought we might be able to utilise this in our study because when you're looking at challenging behaviours, you're kind of assessing, or the function, if you're looking at the functions of challenging behaviours, there's a whole lot of reinforcement history and variation in that individual's environment that might have influenced, their specific sorts of challenging behaviours. And by looking at kind of teaching a new response to this group, we could kind of almost do a fresh assessment of how reinforcing is it to provide negative reinforcement for a new behaviour. And also, in this way, we're kind of not provoking almost engagement in challenging behaviours in the same way that we might during, say, a functional assessment. So what we did is, and I'll go through in a little bit more detail kind of the exact what we did, but we essentially taught a kind of a simple action to request a break and looked at whether there was any difference in the frequency that the Fragile X group engaged in and the learning disability group. And I'll come back to the sort of characteristics of those two groups in a moment. And also, I've sort of said that we think that an environmental challenge like an academic demand might be particularly challenging for someone with Fragile X. But we don't know what aspect of that demand is challenging. Is it the fact that they're having to interact with someone? The kind of social aspects of the demands. You're probably having to make eye contact, sit opposite them. Or is it the kind of simple information processing aspects? Being given really hard work that's kind of putting demands on cognitive systems. So what we wanted to do was have a bit of a look at, are there differences in behaviour when the children are presented with difficult or easy tasks, and when we vary those tasks according to how much social interaction is kind of included within them, how much eye contact and where I'm sitting in relation to the child. So am I sitting face to face or side by side? Because side-by-side teaching is kind of typically recommended for children with Fragile X to reduce the pressure of that inherent eye contact. But there's not been really much research to look at, does that actually change an individual's behaviour? Is it actually helpful? So we wanted to build that in. And so obviously these sort of physiological responses were of key interest in our study. And we wanted to, but typically what people have looked at is the general levels and the patterns of these indicators across a day. But what we wanted to do is very specifically look at the response and recovery when we present, the kind of challenge of interest. When we present a difficult work task, what is sort of physically happening? Is there a difference in the physical reaction to this challenge between children with Fragile X and others who have a learning disability? This kind of stimulus-bound response. So we wanted to have a look at that and then see whether was there any association between these indicators of arousal and the behaviours that we observed in our kind of paradigm, which I will show you now. So I'm sorry, this is a bit of a nightmare to show on a screen, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a feel for what it is that we kind of actually did. So I met with a child at their school. We went to a little side room that was hopefully a bit quieter. In practice, sometimes that was a corridor, the joys of doing kind of research in a kind of natural environment. But what I did is we did an initial saliva sample, which was supposed to be kind of a bit of a baseline measure. And then I presented some difficult work that was selected with that child's teacher and presented it in quite a structured way over a 10-minute period. We then took saliva samples at 5, 20 and an hour after giving that demand. And those timings should allow us to look at, for the two physiological indicators of interest, the cortisol and the alpha amylase, they show slightly different sort of trajectories if a stressor happens. And so by doing those multiple samples, we should have been able to see if that individual had sort of shown this increase in arousal, and then how was their recovery after that? You know, were they staying stressed for a long time, or was it kind of, were they recovering as kind of usual? We then, sort of later on in the day, we did some teaching. So there was slightly different topographies of behaviour, but it was typically putting a block into a box that I would then, when that child did that, they would be allowed a break from the work that they were doing. And we then looked at some different behaviours, but also this kind of escape response in the context of demands that were varied according to how difficult they were and how much kind of, how many kind of social demands there were on that, during that demand. Sorry, I'm aware that I'm dumping lots of information, but essentially what we wanted to do was to go through this protocol with 25 boys that have Fragile X syndrome and 25 children with intellectual disabilities. That again, we experienced quite substantial recruitment problems after very, very, very extensive efforts over a period of, again, 18 months. We eventually managed to get 24 boys with Fragile X, but only 14 children with intellectual disabilities. But happily, they were relatively comparable in their characteristics, with the exceptions that we had some girls in our learning disability group, and our Fragile X group were all boys. And so I'm going to whip through the findings that we had in that study. So obviously one of the key things we were trying to find out is there seem to be motivational differences based on this kind of escape responding, using this escape response that we taught between the Fragile X group and the learning disability group. And interestingly, we did see that a greater proportion of the Fragile X group used this taught kind of escape response than the intellectual disability group. Only one of the comparison group used this response that we taught kind of in the later protocols. And that doesn't seem to be accounted for by kind of greater adaptive behaviour, so kind of quicker picking up of that new response in the Fragile X group. And so it kind of provides some support for this idea that there perhaps is kind of a greater sensitivity to being given a break, or kind of this negative reinforcement. But we expected, for instance, I know gaze avoidance is a really big kind of very prominent characteristic of the Fragile X phenotype, but we saw very limited differences even in things like gaze-related behaviours between the two groups when I was presenting the work tasks. And though it was only a brief assessment that we did to look at the possible sort of aspects of demands that might be challenging, but in our manipulations we didn't see any kind of systematic effect of these kind of condition manipulations, so we didn't pick up anything there. And interestingly, so what we might have expected is that in the Fragile X group we saw higher levels of this kind of stress hormone cortisol than in the intellectual disability group, but that's not what we saw. We saw pretty comparable levels of these indicators between the groups. But a caveat to all of this is that we had real challenges, despite kind of, as in the first study, a lot of the children, were very happy to do the saliva samples, very happy to take part. We had real problems with saliva sample volumes, which is very glamorous. Lots of squeezing swabs and nothing coming out. And 27% of the samples that we collected had insufficient volume for any analysis at all. We lost quite a substantial amount of data that way. And triplicate analysis, basically what you would aim to do with each sample is to test it 3 times, just to account for any variation in pipetting and doing those analyses. but we were only able to do that kind of planned triplicate analysis for less than half of the samples. And we ended up having to discard our alpha amylase data because we just had such levels of such high levels of missing data there. But it was interesting that within the data that we could kind of use, not only did we see no group differences, but overall for both groups, levels of cortisol were in the kind of low expected range. So, we weren't seeing like high levels of arousal in both groups. It's a bit tricky to interpret cortisol findings because it's not a nice, the more stressed you are, the higher your cortisol is. There's a bit of a complex relationship between cortisol and stress over time, whereby in the context of chronic stress, you might see very low levels of cortisol. So perhaps that's why overall we were seeing quite low levels. This was a group that was experiencing, was engaging in lots of challenging behaviour. But essentially we don't really know. It wasn't really the pattern of findings that we'd expected to see, which is interesting in itself. But we weren't able to find any associations between the sort of behaviours that we were looking at and these indicators of arousal. So kind of in summary, there was some support for these kind of motivational differences, but the findings were really quite mixed. And we weren't able to demonstrate any association with physiological measures that we've been looking at. But there were some problems that we had during the study that kind of contributed to these problems. But what we decided to do in the context of these challenges and this lack of association, we wanted to kind of go back to the drawing board for the end of the PhD and really speak with parents and try to gain a really in-depth description of challenging behaviours in the naturalistic context. Across representing parents' experiences over a period of time via semi-structured interviews. So there had been some parent report before, but it was all via very structured kind of measures. So what we wanted to do is give parents the opportunity to really describe what was happening for their sons in particular, with the view of kind of asking, are we looking at the right things? Is our demands really particularly a key influence upon behaviours in this group? And are we do we seem to be looking in the right place by looking at physiological arousal, or are there other things that parents feel are more important or are coming out kind of as trends throughout these interviews? So it's a fun game. So we'd aimed to speak with parents of 10 boys who have Fragile X syndrome. So how long do we think it took to recruit 10 boys with Fragile X syndrome? So we were oversubscribed in less than 24 hours. We had 20 eligible families contact us in the first day, typically. And we ended up interviewing the parents of 12 boys with Fragile X who exhibited challenging behaviour. In the designing of those kind of final projects, we liaised with parents via the Fragile X Society. They've got a research committee, and the parents inputted that they would kind of typically use the language of meltdown rather than challenging behaviour. So we kind of incorporated that into our measures. But we weren't able to take on all 20 just because of kind of time limitations. It was a very nice problem to have though. So we used a semi-structured interview format that was adapted from some research that had been done with people with another condition called Prader-Willi syndrome. And we adapted this kind of Prader-Willi measure in collaboration with the parents to include kind of Fragile X associated kind of things that we might hypothesize in the environment that might be challenging, as well as kind of a range of things and also some characteristics. So parents kind of were involved in adapting that measure a little bit. But we looked at emotions around the time of these meltdowns, looked at topographies of behaviour, the time course, kind of how long are these kind of outbursts, what are the precursors and the management strategies used. And we transcribed and then used in vivo to kind of summarise the results of all of these interviews. So I'm just going to, again, relatively quickly whip over what we found. But basically, it was not the pattern of results that we had necessarily expected based on previous research. So the parents rarely reference sort of demand escape as a primary influence on their son's behaviours. But when they were asked directly, they did endorse that, yes, that has sort of, in the words of the interview, kind of triggered challenging behaviours in the past. As we did expect, sort of seeking attention of other people or attention-maintaining behaviours were relatively uncommon, which reflects previous research. But kind of unlike had been mentioned in previous studies, parents very consistently said that the most common antecedent for engagement in challenging behaviours was being told no. So it was typically that they said that said that their son couldn't have access to something like food, but for some it was like an activity. There was one parent who said that if she saw an elevator, is that what's called, the stairs that move? The escalator. Yeah. That would be they knew that their son would definitely want to go on that and wasn't able to sort of tolerate being told that actually no, we can't do that now, and it would kind of fairly consistently lead to him being aggressive. And when we asked parents what they did, how they managed these behaviours, distraction was the kind of most common and successful prevention and kind of intervention strategy that parents used. And when the parents were describing the kind of emotions that around these behaviours, they said that frustration was the most common kind of perceived emotion prior to these behaviours occurring, and then the child would typically seem very angry whilst they were engaging in these behaviours, which we were kind of surprised because based on sort of our understanding, we'd expect kind of anxiety to be going up quite a lot. This child's seems very anxious, and it's obviously very difficult because this is parents' reports. It's not direct experience, but it gives us a slightly different picture to perhaps what we were expecting to see. So sorry. So basically, after some bouncing back and forward as to what this means, I don't expect you, this hasn't come out very well, but essentially what I wanted to kind of come to is that we'd started out with this relatively simple model that we think arousal equals kind of an increased escape behaviour. It's a nice sort of simple thing, but really that is a very simple model to try and account for a complex phenomenon. So in the last chapter, dumped in this lovely muddled kind of diagram, but the reason I've just plunked it in is to kind of try and highlight that actually there are a huge number of aspects of the Fragile X phenotype, right from kind of physical, cognitive, behavioural, social and environmental influences that need to be accounted for if we're going to kind of fully describe this. Though we couldn't show it through these studies, arousal may well be an important influence. Kind of arousal differences might be important in this group, but this is also in the context of kind of a wide range of possible influences. So basically, it's a kind of, there's probably a lot more going on than you would want, than you would like to think from this lovely initial simple model. So that's kind of my very whistle-stop tour of what we found, but I wanted to kind of focus for the last bit of my chat on some of the sort of limitations, challenges, conclusions from our experiences of doing this research. So obviously I highlighted that recruitment was a real challenge and a real barrier during conducting this project. And whilst families reported that obviously the involvement of saliva samples was acceptable, that's obviously a group that is self-selected for taking part because they obviously aren't horrified by the idea at initial contact. But if we are wanting to do this kind of multidisciplinary work that includes the collection of some physiological measures, how can we kind of engage families? How can we get their views on it so that we can design these studies in a way that would best facilitate people to take part in them? because it was really interesting that in that study that was discussing these behaviours, instantly there were people there wanting to talk about their experiences and share their experiences. But understandably, people have a lot of caregiving responsibilities. Life is very hectic. Probably having some girl come in early in the morning and try and swab your children is not ideal. Addition of stress in that time. So what can we do to make these sorts of studies easier? And this kind of recruitment challenges and relatively small sample sizes are a kind of consistent issue that we have in trying to understand these possible the possible associations between genetic syndromes and challenging behaviours, or behavioural phenotypes more broadly. An interesting consideration that also came up kind of relating to the recruitment problems is the kind of ethical consideration of the fact that during the course of my PhD I became quite involved in the Fragile X community. I initially started volunteering as a trustee and then was invited to apply for the role of kind of running the charity. And fortunately, people are very sort of happy with what I'm doing, and we had the interesting thing in the final study in particular, that a few people said that they were wanting to take part in the research as a kind of thank you to me as an individual, for involvement in the charity. And that was a kind of an interesting one to think through, around motivations to take part in research. Obviously, these people had full access to information as anyone else about the potential benefits and and risks of taking part, but but this isn't unique. There will be clinicians that are involved in doing research, and it's just, for me, highlighted the kind of need to balance those two roles, and as far as possible we kept things separate, using separate communication methods, etc. But ultimately, you're the same person whether you're emailing from your Kent account or your charity account. It's difficult to pull those apart. So there's not an answer to that as such, but it was kind of an interesting thing that came up through it. And so, so whilst we, with sort of recent developments in technology and kind of biotech, we, unlike ever before, are able to gain kind of objective insights into people's internal experiences, which hopefully will facilitate more research looking at how these biological and kind of physical phenomena are interacting with environmental sort of events and potentially influencing challenging behaviours. But these salivary measures are still a really small snapshot into a very complex system, and even and very peripheral measures as well of things that might be going on centrally. In the future, if we did want to specifically look at physiological arousal in more detail, there are new ways of measuring these things coming out. Some really interesting wearable technology. I read a paper, I think it's in the BMJ, about sort of wearable stress patches that can look at skin conductance, so kind of like perspiration, and also can measure heart rate. So that's interesting because you might be able to look at a couple of different indicators in one go. And there was doing the rounds a while back in the news where these kind of a bit like Fitbit kind of wearable tech that can look at heart rate. So it might be in the future that we're able to use these things that are obviously, whilst kind of saliva samples in some ways aren't too invasive compared to, say, blood sampling, it is still having to put something in your mouth. It's, where if there's something you can wear, that might make these things a bit more accessible. And also, a couple of the siblings that took part in that initial study said that, I kind of think, well, my friend's looking at me doing a swab, they thought it was a bit weird. And, wearable tech is such a big thing. Loads of people wear Fitbits, and so it perhaps is a more kind of socially acceptable way for some people as well of doing that. But just to touch upon, if we do think that that physiological arousal is important in Fragile X, kind of, or more broadly, what are the sort of implications of this in practice? And obviously, a kind of clear route is that is providing an individual with practical techniques such as like mindfulness, breathing, to help them manage sort of either proactively or in the moment their overall levels of arousal. And hypothetically, who knows, it might be that there's, if for at least some individuals there were this kind of association between escape, maintain, challenging behaviour and this kind of elevated arousal, then maybe there would be some selective benefit for those individuals. I mean, that's very speculative, but kind of playing it through. And so, as I mentioned, if we did want to have a look in more detail in the future at possible arousal or sort of behaviour associations, then perhaps working with small groups, we could do very in-detail explorations of kind of over a period of time, occurrence of behaviours, environmental context, and sort of perhaps continuous recordings of physiology through things like these wearable watches. So I just wanted to say before questions, like a big thank you to my fab supervisors, Peter, and also Dr. Alison Bratt from the Medway School of Pharmacy, who held my hand through all of the saliva pipetting and the sort of fun sciencey parts of the studies. A huge thank you to all the participants and families and the just wonderful Fragile X Society community more broadly. And those who volunteered to help with the project in terms of doing coding and reliability, and was really lucky to have some sort of financial support through the project. And on a personal level, it feels today kind of appropriate. I'm really lucky to have had lots of fantastic people who influenced me when I was growing up, and my dear friend Mads died yesterday, so I just wanted to dedicate this to her, really. I also, P.S., can send you a reference list because I haven't put it at the end of this. But because you all enjoyed my Simpsons gift so much earlier. Do you have any questions? I might flick off this as well in a minute because I'm distracted.
Thank you, Becky. Any questions? We don't have much time, but 5 minutes. Thank you.
That was really interesting, Becky. I just was wondering whether the children who told you information themselves that might have been interested, in addition to all of the data that you collected. I know that wasn't your focus, but I just was wondering what their views might have been.
Would be really interesting. There's been, we had a bit of a look at the National Fragile X Conference in the States. They have kind of a self-advocacy sort of streams their talks, so there's a lot of young people with Fragile X who go to the talks there. And they were doing some work around sort of people selecting from a field sort of descriptions of what makes me anxious, what anxiety feels like. And there was some, from that, it wasn't sort of a formal study, but from that there were some interesting things that came out, kind of things that wouldn't perhaps to you or I seem particularly stressful, coming out quite high, like hearing someone crying was coming up quite high, which fits with our kind of understanding, a lot of descriptions that parents give around that real awareness of what's going on. So I would love to sort of do something similar and try and think about how we can do that accessibly. In the first study we tried to sort of include the young people in sort of just feeding back about their experiences of doing the saliva sampling and had some sort of easy-read sheets. A lot of them were pretty knackered by the end of the day, so we had pretty limited filling in of those, but I think it's something that would be really, really interesting to look at.
Any more questions? Okay, I've got one very basic question about the saliva sample.
Yes.
Is it not possible just to spit into a tube and get rid of the swab business? Because then you wouldn't have had to have been there they could have just done it when they got up themselves.
So they can do, and there is research where people do, it's kind of like passive drool. That's one option of doing it. We actually found that when we were talking to parents, they found that, and we did it with a few of the children, the sort of passive drool approach, and they found that quite difficult. Kind of that gathering that in the saliva in your mouth and sort of depositing it accurately into a tub. So that's one option for doing it. In terms of not needing to be there to actually conduct it, the reason that we wanted to be there was to kind of around compliance with the timings, because it's particularly important with some of the timings to be getting those right, because otherwise you might miss differences. But I was really surprised. I thought that it would be easier to do the passive draws than it would be the swaps, but in general they seem to find the swaps a bit easier. I think a lot of the young people would sort of chew on them, which is fine for the purposes of cortisol. A bit problematic for the purposes of alpha amylase because it's a digestive enzyme, so if you're chewing it might be stimulating those. But yeah, it's a bit of a tricky. Okay, thank you very much.